Is this some kind of joke?
You know, I was just about to ask the same thing about the raccoon with the laser gun.
It's a quantum igniter, thank you very much. And it can blast you right out of that tin can before...
Measure your weapons later, boys. If we want to survive this, we do it as a team.
Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my video game review series. So those of you who have been following my channel will know that I quite recently reviewed the original Marvel Ultimate Alliance from 2006, which as those of you who saw the video will know is a childhood favourite of mine. As I explained in the video, I was a huge fan of the X-Men Legends games back in the day. In my opinion, those games were some of the most fun, well written and well made RPGs from the 6th generation of gaming. And I honestly think they're criminally underrated. And when Marvel Ultimate Alliance came out, it basically took that exact same concept and added it to the wider Marvel universe, making a game that in my opinion was an absolute blast to play. That's not to say that it was perfect or anything like that. As I explained in the review, the game did have a few technical issues. And in some ways it was a bit dumbed down and simplified from the X-Men Legends games, particularly in regards to the leveling up system and the overall RPG elements. But in my opinion the game had an incredible story, great combat, great level design, and I loved it in spite of its issues. As far as the sequel from 2009 goes, which I also reviewed recently, that's a game that I personally have mixed feelings on. While I concede that there were a few technical improvements from the first game, most notably the improved graphics and presentation, as well as the slightly more refined combat system, I felt that the second game was in many ways a step back from the first. In my opinion, the story was pretty lame and uninspired, at least when compared to the first game. The level design was mediocre for the most part. There was also a lack of variety in terms of enemies and challenges, less interesting hub worlds with little to no reason for exploration, and not as much replay value. I still enjoyed the game for what it was, and I would recommend it to fans of the first game, but just be prepared for a more grounded and less enjoyable experience by comparison. I'll of course leave a link in the description section of this video to those reviews for anybody who's interested. Naturally, with those reviews doing pretty well in terms of viewership, at least for the standards of my channel, I received quite a few requests to review the third game, Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3, from 2019. As you can tell by the title, that's what we're going to be doing today. Believe it or not, when I made those reviews, I had no intentions whatsoever on ever playing or reviewing the third game. Mostly because I don't really play modern games anymore and tend to stick to retro games, since it's more in the spirit of this channel and what I do. But I figured since you guys wanted to know my opinion on it, I might as well buy the game and give it a go. So I did exactly that, bought the game second hand, played through the entire thing, and here it is. Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3 The Black Order, released in 2019, developed by Team Ninja. On a side note, today coincidentally just happens to be the 5th anniversary of the game's initial release. So yeah, I guess you could consider this a 5-year retrospective. Just like my reviews for the first two, this could turn out to be a long video, because I have quite a lot to say about this game and a few mixed feelings on it. I'd appreciate it if you guys would hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one. Let's get started with the review. Before I played the game for the first time, I had several reservations about it right off the bat. The main reason for this is that the previous game in the series came out in 2009, 10 years before this game, meaning the series was basically dead and buried during that time, and it was well and truly considered finished. And of course, over the years, we'd seen a couple of different console generations as well as some massive changes in the overall culture of gaming. I've been gaming for a very long time, since the late 90s in fact, and when you've been a gamer for that long, you pick up certain instincts and intuitions. It's been my experience over the years that when certain franchises stagnate and sequels don't get made within a few years or so, it's usually for a very good reason. When it takes over a decade for a sequel to finally come out, and when it's being made by a different development team, different publishers, different writers, and generally being released in a time where creative visions in the industry are completely different from when the predecessors came out, it usually turns out to be a complete disaster. I mean, how many times have we heard over the years about games that were in development for a very long time, or even just in concept, seeing multiple different developers come and go, and finally being released down the line, being considered antiquated and too little too late. It's become a bit of a cliche at this point. I definitely felt this was a possibility with Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3. The second game didn't perform well, it didn't really add anything worthwhile to the overall series, and it didn't leave much demand for a sequel. Sure, there were die-hard fans of the series who wanted a sequel, but I have to imagine that if the demand was high enough for one, then one would have been made sooner. I've spoken several times in the past on here about how, in my opinion, sometimes it's better for franchises to end, rather than to just be milked to death. And I don't know about you guys, but I didn't really want another Marvel Ultimate Alliance. I didn't think it was necessary. But anyway, the game finally came out in 2019, and in a pretty bizarre turn of events, it was released as a Nintendo Switch exclusive, and the game was actually published by Nintendo. I found this a little bit odd since the previous games in the series were released across all major consoles, but I guess Nintendo wanted to use the license to sell more Switches. I'd imagine they paid a heck of a lot of money for it, considering how insanely popular and lucrative the Marvel brand was at the time, with the massive financial success of the MCU. But hey, if any gaming corporation can afford to waste that amount of money, it's Nintendo. Thankfully I already had a Switch, so I didn't need to buy one just to review this game. And weirdly enough, this is going to be the first Nintendo game that I ever review on this channel. Upon buying the game, before I even played it, I ran into another, I guess you could say, red flag that gave me even more reservations about it. Just looking at the cover of this game gave me chills, because it's very clear from the cover alone that this game has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the previous games in the series. This isn't really a sequel to Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2 when you think about it. Rather, this game is clearly based on the MCU. Before I go any further, I want to go on a bit of a tangent and get a few things off my chest. The reason this game being based on the MCU gave me chills is because, and let me be as blunt as I possibly can here, I despise the MCU. At the risk of enduring the wrath of nerds in the comment section, individuals with an autistic obsession with these Marvel movies, as far as I'm concerned, they represent everything that is wrong with the entertainment industry, and I want to do my best to explain why. Because it's not to say that all those movies are objectively bad or anything like that. For example, I really liked the original Iron Man movie. I think as a standalone movie, that one was really well made. And there were a few movies in the series that I enjoyed along the way, like The Winter Soldier and a few others. But the problem is that for every decent movie in the series, there were about 7 or 8 that were just complete and utter corporate slop. For example, after Iron Man came out, you had a whole bunch of follow-up movies released over the next couple of years or so, all of which felt like trailers for the Avengers movie, movies that added nothing of consequence to the story, were aggressively mediocre and forgettable, and just felt like corporate products coming off of a conveyor belt rather than actual movies with any substance that could really be considered great standalone movies. Movies like Captain America, Thor, Iron Man 2, all these bland, forgettable, inconsequential movies that existed only to set up the next main movie in the series. And over the years, it just started to get a little bit silly. They started releasing a new Marvel movie like every few months or so, literally multiple movies a year, each one as forgettable as the last. With the quality getting worse and worse as time went on, they basically ran out of ideas and had no creative vision at all, and all those movies just descended into CGI-filled, pop culture reference-riddled nonsense. Just filled to the brim with forced humour, self-reference, nostalgia bait, and all that crap that we've come to expect from these superhero movies now. And what's crazy about those movies to me is how, despite how successful they were and how much money they made, they went completely into obscurity not long after coming out. I mean, they made 3 Ant-Man movies. And despite the last one just coming out not too long ago, nobody even talks about those movies anymore. I mean, the Black Panther movie that was absolutely hyped to no end when it came out, and the mainstream media wouldn't shut up about it. All the nerds in the comment section spamming Wakanda forever, Wakanda forever. Then about a year later, that movie went completely into obscurity. Now nobody talks about it anymore. They made a sequel that completely bombed, and just again went completely into obscurity as soon as it came out. It had no lasting impact whatsoever. See, the problem with those movies, and I know I'm rambling a bit here, but I said I'd go on a tangent, is that they can be superficially entertaining, and there's nothing wrong with that. But once you turn your brain back on, and actually start to think about them a little bit, you realise that the writing of those movies, and how they all fit together, is so bad, and makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, to the point where it's literally stupid. I mentioned before, those movies feel like corporate products, being mass-produced one after the other, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if they were written by AI. And for me personally, the absolute worst thing about those movies is the fan base. I can't take the fan base of those MCU movies, at least the ones that I've had the displeasure of interacting with. Some of the most immature, masochistic, cultish people I have ever come across. You even dare to criticise a single thing about any of those movies. You mention anything about the writing, the numerous plot holes, the absolutely toe-curlingly cringy dialogue, and forced humour that all those movies have, the terrible CGI, the crappy acting, and the overall corporate slop vibes that those movies give anybody with a functioning brain, and these people will attack you mercilessly. I seem to remember when Endgame came out, which was a movie with a plot that made absolutely no sense whatsoever. It was again a superficially entertaining, incoherent mess. Critics were actually receiving death threats for daring to criticise anything about that movie. So yeah, where am I going with this? I despise the MCU. I refuse to have anything to do with it these days, and I can't stand the rabid fan base. Don't ask questions, just consume product and get excited for next product. But I digress. Long story short, this game being visually based on the MCU gave me even more concerns about it. Thankfully though, to the game's credit, despite being visually based on the MCU, it doesn't actually take place in the same continuity as it. Rather, it's got its own original story that was based largely on the Infinity Saga from the comics, which the MCU itself was of course based on. Unfortunately, that comes with some problems of its own. This isn't the OG Marvel comics that we grew up with, that the first 2 games took inspiration from. No, the continuity that this game takes place in is very much modern Marvel, and everything that comes along with it. It has all the cringy new mannerisms adopted by the characters. It has new characters like that annoying, cringy, self-insert character Kamala Khan, who nobody likes and nobody asked for, yet Marvel keeps shoving her down our throats for some reason. It makes no attempt whatsoever to tie in with the previous 2 games, or even acknowledge the existence of those games, making the title Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3 seem a little bit disingenuous to me, since it's clearly not the same series. But whatever, despite all this, and despite my reservations that I had, And me by my own admission being an old school Marvel fan, who rejects all the modernised crap in the recent adaptations, to where I avoid it altogether, I was willing to look past all that and give this game a chance, judging it on its own merit, rather than as part of a series. So how is this game? Was it worth the 10-year wait, and does it present a reason to buy a Nintendo Switch? Let's talk about it. So just like the first two games, it's once again a third-person action-adventure RPG with an isometric view. The story of the game is a pretty basic one. I'd say it's on par with your average MCU movie on how much it makes sense, which for a video game doesn't really matter. The game begins with the Guardians of the Galaxy flying their ship through space, where they randomly pick up a signal indicating an object of immense cosmic power, located in the middle of an asteroid field.
Rocket, any idea why our ship is on the fritz?
I might have installed a new scanner I whipped up that detects high concentrations of unusual energy. Cosmic cubes, negabands, Asgardian hammers. You know, the kind of stuff people pay big money for.
But there's nothing out here but rocks.
If I were hiding an object of immense cosmic power, I would want it to look that way as well.
Can you lead us to it?
Can I? Psh, bet your hairless pink butt I can.
This leads them to a seemingly abandoned Kree ship that they decide to land on and check out. You take control of the Guardians, who serve as the game's default team of 4. If you're wondering how this works with there being 5 Guardians instead of 4, basically Groot and Rocket are one playable character. Rocket riding on Groot's back, with Rocket being of course responsible for ranged attacks and Groot covering the melee attacks. That was a pretty cool idea, I actually really liked that, I thought it was quite cute. Here you get to explore the Kree ship a bit, and you get a useful tutorial that helps to introduce you to the game's overall controls and technicalities. The game, to its credit, does a decent enough job of introducing and explaining its overall premise. Thankfully, the game doesn't do anything drastically different from the previous two in terms of its overall controls. However, as you could imagine, there are some major changes to the game's user interface, as well as the combat and gameplay, most of which were negative changes in my opinion, but we'll get to that later. When exploring the Kree ship, you come across Nebula, who serves as the game's first boss. You learn that she was in the process of aiding the Kree in an attempt to set a trap for somebody, but wouldn't say who that was. After kicking her ass as well as Ronan the Accuser, the team gets ambushed by one of Thanos' minions, a group known as the Black Order, who are attempting to acquire all the Infinity Stones. This leads the team to getting ported to Earth, where they come across Spider-Man and the rest of the Ultimate Alliance, of course giving you access to the main roster, and this is where the game really begins. Nick Fury, who is now the Samuel L. Jackson version and not the version from the first two games, tasked the team with hunting down the Infinity Stones to prevent Thanos from acquiring them. As I said, it's a pretty basic story that you've probably heard already. As far as the overall gameplay goes, the game's overall formula is pretty simple. You once again traverse a whole bunch of linear levels, defeating waves of generic enemies, solving basic puzzles, and taking on a whole bunch of supervillains from the Marvel series. When traversing levels, you take control of a team of 4 superheroes, and can switch between them at any time using the directional buttons. Speaking of, this is probably a good enough time to talk about the game's roster. Just like the previous games, you have a whole bunch of heroes from the Marvel universe to choose from, and the roster this time is actually bigger than the previous two, though sadly, unlike the previous two, you can't unlock every character on a first playthrough, at least I don't think you can. Once you gain access to the main roster, you get a certain amount of characters to choose from, and many more will become available as you progress through the story. Some of the characters will be unlocked automatically at a predetermined point in the story, and others can be unlocked by performing a particular challenge or side activity. And of course, with this being a modern game, some of them are DLC, but screw that. The characters you start off with are of course the Guardians of the Galaxy who I previously mentioned, as well as Captain America, Iron Man, Spider-Man, Thor, Crystal, the Incredible Hulk, Scarlet Witch, Captain Marvel, and Wolverine. Characters who will be unlocked along the way are Hawkeye, Black Panther, Venom, Daredevil, Luke Cage, Elsa Bloodstone, whoever that is, Psylocke, Doctor Strange, Ghost Rider, Deadpool, who is nowhere near as funny or as interesting as he was in the first game.
Taco! Taco night! We're gonna eat while the X-Men fight! Yeah! Oh. There, give me the lyrics. Oh, and taco, yeah, it's gorgeous and
But he does bring that meta humour to the game, which is kinda stale at this point, but I digress. Storm, Wasp. Yeah, they added Wasp to this game, just to remind you of those crappy Ant-Man movies. Yeah, those exist. Those three stupid, modern self-insert characters whose existence I will not acknowledge. And last but not least, my personal favourite, Nightcrawler.
Save some for us, mein Freund.
Yeah, as soon as I unlocked Nightcrawler, I basically had him on my team all the time, particularly since he seemed to be the most effective in combat, being able to spam rapid sword attacks, taking out even the toughest enemies. In addition to these characters, there are also some that can be unlocked by completing challenges, such as Magneto, Loki, Thanos, and Elektra. You also have a few characters who are hidden behind a DLC paywall, but the less said about that, the better. Moving on. So yeah, the game has a pretty solid roster, and most of the characters from previous games are present, but not all of them, which is a shame. And I'm sure I forgot to mention some of them, but whatever, it is what it is. Each character will once again have their own unique abilities, such as their superpowers, fighting styles, and inherent abilities. For example, some characters are quick, flashy, and can perform rapid combination attacks. Others are larger, stronger, and more durable, serving as tank characters. Some characters have powerful ranged attacks and energy attacks that can be used in certain situations. Once again, some characters have the ability to fly, and that can help you get around levels quicker, and reach high up areas and collectibles that the other characters can't. Characters such as Spider-Man and Venom can once again swing on webs, as an alternative to flying. Deadpool and Nightcrawler can also teleport, which can help you to flank enemies and avoid traps and hazards in the environment. All this stuff is basically recycled from previous games, and anything I said in the previous reviews can be applied here. There aren't a whole lot of changes in regards to the formula, however there are a few minor changes in regards to the combat. Most notably, they took away the ability to grab a hold of enemies, so you can no longer grab an enemy and throw them off a cliff, or pick them up and use them as a melee weapon, or hold them in place and perform a beatdown. I'm not sure why they removed this, but it is what it is. In my opinion, it just makes the game feel like more of a generic button masher. Thankfully, you can still pick up certain objects in the environment and throw them at enemies, so that's something, I guess. You once again have light attacks and heavy attacks and can mix them up in combinations. By holding down the trigger, you get a selection of superpowers to choose from for each character, and these will once again be allocated to a particular button. There are 4 powers for each character, and these usually feel very different from one another. In my review for the second game, I mentioned how they removed the extreme abilities, which were a major part of both X-Men Legends games, as well as the first Marvel Ultimate Alliance, instead replacing them with combination abilities. Well, in this game, to its credit, they brought back the extreme powers. Once a particular character's momentum meter fills, you can activate that character's extreme power. These do a huge amount of damage to all enemies in the vicinity, and are also quite effective against bosses, more on those later. These are once again unique for each character, and I really like that they were brought back. You can also combine these extreme attacks just like in the first game, to make them more powerful.
You ain't seen nothing
Allow
yet.
me. Any room for me?
Strike as one, my friend.
Just wait until your entire party receives a momentum boost, and activate the extreme attacks all at once. This is badass and can do a significant amount of damage to all enemies within a certain radius, so use it well. Another addition to combat is the synergy attacks. These allow 2 characters to combine their powers when they're near each other, making a particular attack significantly more effective in combat. These will usually happen by accident in my experience, from just playing the game and spamming the attack buttons. Again, these are very effective in combat, and quite useful against bosses. In fact, at higher levels you can pretty much cheese bosses by spamming these, but again, more on the bosses later. So yeah, that pretty much sums up the game's combat. It's very similar to the first two games, but without the grappling abilities and the throws and beatdowns, it just feels like more of a button masher to me. What doesn't help in this regard is the lack of overall enemy variety. Most of the enemies in the game just feel like reskinned versions of each other. With the exception of larger enemies like the Sentinels, these were quite interesting. They reminded me of the Sentinels from X-Men Legends. The second game had this exact same problem. The combat got very repetitive after a while. It didn't seem as versatile as the first game. Another thing that annoyed me was the ragdoll physics. This is one of them games where you get constantly knocked to the ground by larger enemies, and this is so annoying. The game does have a block feature, but in my experience this wouldn't work very often, and it seemed to be tacked on. In addition to combat, the game also has some very basic puzzle solving mechanics, as well as some areas where you have to avoid traps and hazards. These are very easy and barely even worth talking about, but I suppose they do their bit to add some variety to the game. It's just a shame that there wasn't more effort put into them. Aside from that, there isn't really much else to talk about in regards to the gameplay. If you've played any of the X-Men Legends games or the first two Ultimate Alliance games, then you pretty much know what to expect from the overall formula. And there isn't really anything that this game adds to the overall equation that takes the series forward in any way, which for a game released 10 years after its predecessor is honestly quite shocking. I think that's the thing that disappointed me most about this game, just how little was added to the overall formula. This game doesn't really have anything from a gameplay perspective that sets it apart from the other games in the series or RPGs in general. It doesn't have any innovations in its combat or its level design, and it's just more of the same, which for me is just not good enough. Speaking of level design, the levels themselves look pretty nice, and I did like the overall art style, and there's plenty of variety in terms of the visual and aesthetics of each level. You visit several locations from the Marvel universe, such as Asgard, Wakanda, the X-Mansion, the Dark Dimension, the Kree ship, the Avengers Tower. You even visit Atalan briefly at one point. The game culminates with a final showdown that takes place in nowhere. It all looks great. But unfortunately, it has the same problem that the second game had in the sense that it just feels very restrictive. There are invisible walls everywhere in the game, and you're forced to traverse a very linear, very specific path throughout. Don't get me wrong, there are a few small secret hidden areas behind walls, and quite a few collectibles to find. But these are all very easy to find due to the linear nature of the levels. You can find these rift portals in certain levels that give you access to a particular challenge. These basically consist of refighting one of the game's bosses, but with their stats boosted up significantly higher, meaning that they basically become major damage sponges and take ages to beat. You can earn particular rewards such as unlockable characters and upgrades from doing this. I'll be honest guys, I got sick and tired of these after the first few, and I basically gave up on them midway. They're just so boring. Speaking of collectibles, you have these boxes all over the game that can be broken open to access some of the collectibles. Some of them can simply be broken using regular attacks, others will require a specific power or synergy to access. These collectibles consist of XP boosts, which are pretty self-explanatory in what they do, as well as these items called ISO crystals. These are all implemented into the RPG elements and leveling up system. Speaking of the leveling up system, it's pretty simple here. As you defeat enemies and complete objectives, your characters will level up automatically. When you receive enough action and ability points, you can upgrade each character's power one at a time. You can also use the XP boost to level up your characters quicker. One thing I notice is that you level up very quickly in this game, and it doesn't take that long to unlock all the game's powers and abilities. When you unlock a new character, they will usually be at the same level as your highest leveled character in your party. As I mentioned before, you can add ISO crystals to each character's infantry that gives them particular perks. There are sometimes even negative effects that come along with them, but not always. To be perfectly honest, you could probably ignore these altogether and it wouldn't make much of a difference. Another thing that you'll accumulate throughout the game is the credits. These can be used to upgrade the grid in the menu that helps to increase your character's stats. be sure to invest in these to make the game a bit easier. The game also has a whole bunch of boss battles, and these are okay for the most part. They're nothing special, but at very least it adds a bit of a spectacle to the game. These look pretty cool. Just like the first two, you have a whole bunch of regular bosses as well as main bosses. These are usually larger and more challenging. For some examples of regular bosses, you take on the likes of Nebula, Bullseye, Red Skull, Claw, Loki, Doctor Strange, Elektra, Maximus, and several others. For the main bosses, you take on the likes of Sandman, Kingpin, Surtur, Dormammu, Dr. Octopus, MODOK, Ultron, Ultimo, and several others. You also take on the Black Order, who are Thanos' main henchmen, several times throughout the game, since they serve as the game's main threat, and of course you take on Thanos himself towards the end, as well as his son Thane. Again, the boss battles are okay, and they look cool. I don't really have any major criticisms for them, but they're really nothing special. That's pretty much all I have to say about the game itself. It's a decent enough beat 'em up that you might have fun with for a while, but for some reason I just couldn't really get into it, and once I beat the game, I had absolutely no interest in replaying it. Again, the second game had the exact same problem in my opinion, and it feels like a deja vu to me. When completing the game, you do unlock a couple of new difficulty settings, and there are several modes and challenges that can be accessed in the menu. For example, you can access the Danger Room, where you get a bunch of time trials and combat challenges and stuff like that. And you can also replay those Rift challenges that I mentioned earlier. In addition to all this, the game has a few bonus features. For example, you get a gallery where you can view the game's character models, and you even get a bio to read for each character. You also get plenty of concept art to look at, as well as a jukebox to play the game's music. Features like this are always appreciated by me. You can also play some of the game's voice lines for each character in a pretty bizarre feature. So yeah, that pretty much sums up everything the base game has to offer. And I have to be honest about it guys, it was a pretty lackluster experience and I didn't really care for this game. I think taking into consideration that it's a game from 2019, made 10 years after the second game, it's shocking to see just how little innovation was added. And I wouldn't say that the story was particularly interesting either. As I mentioned earlier, it's just another adaptation of the Infinity Saga, and if you're into that, then you could just watch the Avengers movies, because the gameplay isn't anything to write home about here. The graphics and presentation are okay I guess, but again this game came out in 2019, and by that standard, I don't think it looks much better than the second game. In fact, I'd actually go as far as to say that the cutscenes in the second game look significantly better as far as I'm concerned. With more detailed and less cartoony character models, as well as more realistic environments, this game has that overly polished, Fortnite-esque look to it. Also, it has plenty of that cringy MCU dialogue that I mentioned earlier that put me right off it. The game does have a couple of DLCs, most notably one that takes place in the aftermath of the main story, where Doctor Doom, who was of course the main villain of the first game, returns to try to acquire the Infinity Stones for himself. And the main selling point of it is that you now get to play as the Fantastic Four. Now I don't know about you guys, but this made me laugh. I mean, you could already play as every member of the Fantastic Four in the first two games from the very beginning, but Nintendo had the nerve to hide them behind a paywall in this game. Yeah, that's hilarious, but I digress. All in all, I found this game to be an underwhelming experience and I wouldn't recommend it. And I'm sure some of you are probably going to point out that some of my criticisms for this game can also be applied to the first two games. And that's true to an extent, but you have to take into consideration the technical limitations of the time. This game came out in 2019, and for a modern game, I expect more. I expect better. And for the third game in the series to come out all these years later, and for it to add nothing of note to the overall formula, makes this game a massive disappointment in my opinion. I give Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3 a disappointing yet generous 5 out of 10. Just underwhelming and mediocre. Thanks for watching guys, I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. Once again, if you did then I'd appreciate it if you'd hit the like button since it really helps the channel. And be sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. Hopefully this video actually gets views, since quite a few people requested it. Particularly since my Crash Bandicoot video bombed harder than that Tim Burton Dumbo movie a few years back. Let me know what you guys think. Stay tuned for more retrospective video game reviews. Once again, I have a lot of reviews coming to the channel in the near future. Thanks for watching and God bless.